The entire US-China trade war flipped upside down. A week ago, the New York Fed researchers basically said Americans are paying almost all the tariffs. Several days later, Trump declared the US trade deficit had been reduced by 78% and victory was near. Then boom, a 220% tariff hits a tiny black mineral most people only know from pencils, but it could make your next electric car $1,500 more expensive. Germany signals it won't blindly follow Washington. And global supply chains quietly reroute around the chaos. 5 separate pieces of news hit the audience almost back to back. It shows the US has lost the trade war to China despite improving numbers. The trade war has already been grinding on for more than a year in its latest phase, less like a negotiation and more like a full-on poker game where both players just shoved all their chips into the middle of the table. That wasn't trial balloons. It wasn't diplomatic wordplay. It wasn't from sources familiar with the matter. That was hard data, tariff hikes, presidential victory laps, European warnings, and global supply chains quietly rearranging themselves. Some people were celebrating. Some were sweating over spreadsheets. Some were getting blown up by their own tariff bombs. And some were standing at a safe distance, popcorn in hand, wondering what discount opportunities might fall out of the chaos. Let's unpack what actually happened and what it really means. The first bomb, the New York Fed drops a spreadsheet grenade. The first shockwave came from the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. Late on February 12, 2026, the New York Fed released research examining who actually pays U.S. tariffs. And the findings cut straight through one of the central political narratives of the Trump administration's trade strategy. Between January and August 2025, U.S. importers absorbed 94% of the tariff costs. By November, that figure was still 86%. In plain English, when Washington says China pays, the invoice usually lands in America. It wasn't some rogue grad student paper. Similar findings had been reported earlier by CBS News on February 12, citing the same research. Economists like Geeta Gopinath and Brent Neiman have long argued that tariffs are largely passed through to U.S. import prices. The German-based Kiel Institute for the World Economy went even further, labeling the 2025 tariff escalation an American own goal, and concluding that U.S. firms and consumers bore nearly all the burden, with foreign exporters absorbing only around 4%. If tariffs were supposed to be a financial boomerang that hit China, the data suggested they instead came back like a frisbee, smacking the thrower. The White House reaction was swift and furious. Kevin Hassett, head of the National Economic Council, appeared visibly angry. He called the report embarrassing and claimed its methodology wouldn't pass a first-semester economics class. He even floated the idea that researchers deserved disciplinary action. That's the economic equivalent of yelling at the thermometer because you don't like the temperature. And when someone challenges the U.S. government or questions whether its officials have any common sense, the Trump administration gets more idiotic. In a previous video, we said the U.S. government officials are unprofessional, we need to apologize. We must rephrase it like this: it takes pains to find someone who is still mentally and intellectually normal. Kevin Hassett defended the broader strategy: if production returns to the U.S., domestic demand rises, wages increase, China suffers, and American consumers ultimately benefit. It's a coherent theory, but theories run into trouble when the numbers refuse to cooperate. And then, almost at the same time, came the second bomb: Trump declares victory. While economists were arguing over spreadsheets, President Donald Trump posted on Truth Social that the U.S. trade deficit had collapsed by 78% thanks to his tariffs, and that 2026 could see America post its first trade surplus in decades. The global financial press practically choked on its espresso. There was, technically, some data behind the claim. U.S. goods and services trade deficit numbers had fallen sharply. But context matters. Trade balances fluctuate for many reasons: currency movements, inventory cycles, recession signals, front-loading imports before tariff deadlines, and demand slowdowns. A sudden contraction in imports can reduce the deficit, but it can also signal slowing consumption. The key question: was this structural rebalancing or temporary compression? Trump didn't specify the time frame or calculation basis behind the 78% figure. He didn't need to. The message was political, not academic. Tariffs work. On the one hand, Fed economists say Americans are paying the bill. On the other hand, the president declared a historic victory. Same night. Same country. Two completely different stories. But they both hide one fact: the US government is the ultimate winner, as it pocketed the tariff, whether from American consumers or foreign exporters. That alone would have been dramatic enough. A greedy and not-so-smart government tries to humiliate the wisdom of 350 million American people. But then came the third bomb: 220% tariffs on Chinese graphite. On February 11, the U.S. Department of Commerce quietly raised countervailing duties on Chinese graphite anode materials from 11.58% to 66.68%. When stacked on top of existing anti-dumping and base tariffs, the effective rate exceeded 220%. In simple math, a $100 shipment of Chinese graphite now faces over $220 in tariffs, bringing its price to more than triple. Graphite might sound like something we used in middle school pencils. But in the electric vehicle era, it's strategic. Graphite is the core anode material in lithium-ion batteries. No graphite, no battery. No battery, no EV. It's often called the black gold of the clean energy transition. China dominates graphite processing. While the U.S. imports natural graphite from several countries, China controls more than 90 to 95% of spherical graphite processing capacity, the higher value form required for EV batteries. In 2024, the U.S. imported around 60,000 tons of natural graphite, of which roughly 43% came from China. But raw material is only part of the story. The choke point is processing. So what happens when tariffs exceed 220%? American EV makers face three unpleasant options: keep buying Chinese graphite and swallow massive cost increases; switch to immature domestic suppliers, risking quality issues; rapidly build domestic capacity, which takes years and billions of dollars. Companies like Tesla and Panasonic have warned that there are no immediately viable replacements. Industry estimates suggest battery costs rise by about $7 per kilowatt-hour, translating to about $1,500 more per vehicle for a standard EV. Someone pays. Either manufacturers eat thinner margins during an already brutal EV price war, or consumers see higher sticker prices. So the tariff nuke intended to decouple supply chains with China risks detonating America's domestic EV industry. Strategic decoupling is easy to declare. It's expensive to implement. The fourth bomb: Germany steps in. While Washington and Beijing traded economic artillery, Europe made its move. At the Munich Security Conference, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz warned against further escalation of global tariff wars. He made it clear, if the US chooses broad tariff escalation, Europe will not automatically follow. Instead, he hails future cooperation with China. Germany's auto industry, already under pressure from Chinese EV competition and domestic energy costs, is exploring deeper engagement with China to offset structural declines in exports. Merz explicitly referenced strategic partnership. Earlier in January, 8 European countries, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, issued a joint statement warning that tariff escalation risks damaging transatlantic relations and triggering dangerous retaliatory cycles. The subtext was unmistakable. If Washington builds a full tariff fortress, Europe might pivot eastward. In global trade chess, it matters. The EU and China are each other's major trading partners. German automakers rely heavily on access to the Chinese market. China also relies on European industrial machinery and high-end manufacturing equipment. If Europe refuses to line up behind Washington, the United Front strategy weakens. The fifth bomb: trade shifts, not disappears. Here's the most quietly devastating statistic. Between January and November 2025, U.S. imports from China fell from $401 billion to $288 billion year-on-year. That looks like tariff success. But government data shows much of that decline was offset by increased imports from Vietnam, Mexico, and European suppliers. In other words, supply chains rerouted. Consumers didn't stop buying. They just bought from different factories, sometimes Chinese-owned factories operating in Southeast Asia. This phenomenon, often called trade diversion, has been documented extensively since the first Trump-era tariff wave in 2018 to 2019. Studies by institutions such as the Peterson Institute for International Economics found that tariffs reduce direct Chinese imports, but increase sourcing from third countries, often at higher prices and benefiting the same Chinese companies. So the trade deficit with China shrinks nominally, but the overall U.S. trade deficit is not necessarily reduced. It's like squeezing one side of a balloon. The global context: everyone blinked except China. Since Trump's return to office in January 2025, tariffs have been expanded to a baseline 10% on nearly all imports, with higher rates on strategic sectors. Allies also faced pressure. The EU initially resisted threats of 25% tariffs but ultimately negotiated lower rates while committing billions in U.S. investment. Japan and South Korea made concessions on autos and agriculture. Even countries like Canada and Mexico felt pressure despite existing trade agreements. Emerging markets from Brazil to India faced compliance dilemmas. China, however, responded with immediate counter-tariffs when the first 10% wave hit in February 2025. It expanded duties on U.S. soybeans, LNG, and agricultural products. It accelerated its export diversification toward Europe, Africa, Russia, and markets along the Belt and Road Initiative. Rather than matching rhetoric with rhetoric, Beijing focused on trade restructuring. China has been reducing dependence on U.S. markets for years. The U.S. share of China's exports has declined significantly compared to the early 2000s. Meanwhile, regional trade agreements like RCEP and deepening energy ties with Russia have diversified flows. The Chinese deliberately targeted its retaliation in politically sensitive U.S. sectors like agriculture and energy. And they expedited long-term diversification to reduce structural exposure. That doesn't mean China is unaffected. Slower global demand, tech export restrictions, and investment uncertainty all carry costs. China is not a paradise, and not all Chinese are angels with wings. But the idea that tariffs alone would force China to surrender quickly hasn't materialized. So, who's actually winning? Let's be honest, trade wars don't produce clean winners. Tariffs are taxes. They distort supply chains. They raise input costs. They create political theater. Yes, certain domestic industries in the U.S. may benefit temporarily from protection, and trade balances can narrow. But broader macroeconomic effects are complex, including higher consumer prices, business uncertainty, supply chain restructuring costs, retaliatory cycles, and investment hesitancy. The 78% deficit reduction claim may reflect real short-term compression, but sustainable rebalancing requires structural productivity gains, not just tariff barriers. Meanwhile, the New York Fed's research suggests that much of the cost burden falls on the domestic economy. Europe is hedging. Supply chains are migrating. China is adapting. American EV makers are calculating battery costs with a migraine. And global markets are watching. The deeper story isn't just tariffs. It's fragmentation. The post-Cold War era was defined by global integration. The U.S. championed open trade under the WTO framework. China entered the WTO in 2001 and became the world's factory. Now, strategic competition is redefining economics. Semiconductors, rare earths, batteries, AI hardware, these aren't just commercial products. They're geopolitical assets. The graphite case is symbolic. Control over battery inputs equals leverage in the EV transition. The question is whether decoupling can happen without triggering inflation, stagnation, or alliance fractures. Europe's posture suggests not everyone wants a clean split. The message was clear. The president declares tariff triumph. The central bank's research says Americans are paying. Tariffs on graphite exceed 220%. Germany signals independence, and trade shifts but doesn't vanish. The table wasn't just flipped. It was set on fire. But here's the irony: after you flip the table, you still need somewhere to sit and eat. Will Washington and Beijing return to negotiation? Will Europe drift towards strategic autonomy? Will supply chains permanently regionalize? History suggests trade wars often end not with victory parades, but with quiet recalibration. 2026 is the year of the fire horse in the Chinese zodiac, and China has become a wild horse, starting at a full gallop, not handicapped as Donald Trump expected 1 year ago. And if there's one certainty in global economic uncertainties, it's this. When politicians say someone else is paying, Americans might want to check their own receipts.